So, Asha, how screwed are we?
It's complicated. I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet.
Wow. I don't even know where to begin, Asha. What a dark time.
Yeah, there's really no sugarcoating it. I think we need to let our listeners know it's going to be bad. And I think that we can talk about the ways that it will be bad. However, I think it's important that we be clear-eyed and realistic so that we're prepared for what's to come, but also not become despondent or apathetic and feel that, everything is futile.
I agree with that. I guess from my perspective, Asha, I think it's important for us to be reality based, as we've always been. One thing that I try to do is be very grounded about all of this legal stuff that we're talking about, not get over our skis on that. I want to be the same way here. I mean, I did make some comments on Twitter that people were like, "Oh, it's pie in the sky." I didn't view it that way. I think
What did you
that
say on Twitter? I mean, I
so
remember it and I retweeted it. It was
yes.
pretty optimistic. And I think I also felt when I read it, I was like, yeah, okay.
Well, I didn't view it that way. So I'll tell you what I said. I essentially said that one thing that I kind of said from the outset is I think this feels a lot different than 2016. I think that much we can agree on. That's not optimistic. In that 2016, no one knew what to expect from Donald Trump. And his election almost felt like an accident in the sense that Hillary Clinton didn't take him seriously. She was trying to run up the score. She didn't spend time campaigning in Wisconsin and Michigan and so on. This time, everyone knew the stakes. $1 billion was spent in 100 days, and a whole focus on those battleground states, and it was a whooping. It was a pretty substantial victory by Donald Trump. And we know exactly what we're getting this time. The voters
Mhm.
knew what they were getting, and so on. Now, I acknowledge all that. I think that what I was focused on was a takeover of the DOJ and an abuse of power in criminal law by Donald Trump. And that's a very narrow focus. And on that focus, what I said was if Donald Trump abuses his power and goes after his political enemies, Nancy Pelosi, Jack Smith, George Conway, whoever he thinks perceives as his rivals, his enemies, his whatever, I do think there are procedural protections in our Constitution that will be meaningful. And to me, the most basic is a trial by jury. And I think the fact that at the end of the day, 12 people in Manhattan have to agree that George Conway goes to prison is some measure of protection that may ultimately be a bulwark against tyranny. Obviously, it doesn't reach all the other problems. I mean, it doesn't say anything about migrants or foreign policy or all sorts of other things. But I think on that core issue of will he just take every one of his political enemies and put him in a camp, I do think that that some of the fears are overstated on that.
So here's where I think you might be glossing over some problems. So, as you know, as a trial lawyer yourself, juries convict based on evidence. And I think a part of what was protecting people from these kinds of political prosecutions is that there were other hurdles that enforced good faith, integrity, playing by the book when it comes to doing prosecutions before, in even investigating and gathering evidence. Here's the thing. Given the Supreme Court's immunity ruling, I really don't see what would stop a Trump DOJ from fabricating evidence. What would stop them? I mean, let's look at this. Be honest. This is exactly what he tried to make Jeffrey Clark do. He wanted Jeffrey Clark to create to write a letter making false allegations that there was voter fraud in Georgia, put that on DOJ letterhead, and send it down to give the imprimatur of the Justice Department in order to launch an investigation in Georgia. Now, what happened then? The senior leadership at DOJ all threatened to resign en masse because they understood that if Jeffrey Clark, the then acting attorney general, did that, that was illegal. But the Supreme Court has now basically said, not even basically, has said that that was an official act. His order to Jeffrey Clark was an official act. Trump is immune for that. Now, you might say, well, Jeffrey Clark could be prosecuted. Actually, no, he can't, because you can't use the fact that Trump asked him to do it as evidence because it's an official act. There's no way that Jeffrey Clark would be held accountable for that either. So if there's no disincentive to engage in that kind of activity, I think that this really will be a banana republic. That this, if they want to, they can gin up investigations and not only just do it for harassment, but they can actually fabricate evidence. And, you know, who will be there to, what guardrails do you think will stop them that the judicial process could realistically weed out? In other words, who would be the eyes inside that would know that this has happened?
Mm-hmm. No, look, I'm not suggesting that what you're saying, that there's nothing to that. I think a couple of things, though, a couple of points that I want to make with you. There's a difference between something being theoretically possible and the cost to do it, or the difficulty of doing it and pulling it off. And I'm going to use an example everyone in this podcast is familiar with. Is it possible to prosecute Donald Trump when he was running for office and so on? Yes. In fact, it started to happen. But there was all sorts of realities that came into play that made it difficult, and delays and problems and things like that. The reality of fabricating evidence to create a prosecution is much more difficult than ginning it up might seem like when we talk about it on a podcast. Yes, Donald Trump wanted Jeffrey Clark to write a letter. That never would have been something that would have created some disinformation and created a cloud over the election. When Donald Trump's claims got into courts and he had the likes of Giuliani and Ellis and all these people trying to gin up something, they never were able to come up with anything. I mean, it wasn't like those people were stopped by the law. It was very difficult. When you got down to it, it was very hard to create evidence that couldn't be disproven in court. Is it possible? Sure. Is it possible that, there's going to be people claiming that George Conway committed some crime? Potentially. And they'll be cross-examined, and the juries are just going to have to believe them. But at the end of the day, you're going to have judges who are appointed by life overseeing that process. You're going to have a jury that has to unanimously find that. It's hard. I think it's provides a measure of protection that I don't think you're taking seriously enough in practice.
What about 10 eyewitnesses who said that George Conway did commit a crime? And who cares if they're perjuring themselves? Because if anything were to happen to them as a result of that perjury, which might be the one crime that might be in the jurisdiction of the court rather than the Justice Department to punish in some way, Trump could just pardon.
Yeah, it is an issue. I mean, there's no question that could potentially happen. I think that is harder to pull off in a way that doesn't create more problems for the Trump administration. In other words, I understand what you're saying. Theoretically, could that happen? Yes. Could that happen someday? Yes. I don't really see that as something in the short run that I think that to pull that off in a way that um, would not be easily called into question publicly and create problems for them. I don't think you could do it. I think it's more likely they're going to be doing things in the short run. Could they initiate criminal investigations? Yes. Could that impose costs on, let's say, I'm using George Conway. I don't need to pick on him. Jack Smith, let's just say hypothetically, since he's in the crosshairs. Yes, that could impose costs on Jack Smith. Could that, potential? Could they even try to file a case against Jack Smith? Yes, maybe. But at a certain point, I think it won't get too far down the road. Remember Andrew McCabe? Remember when they tried to gin up a case against him? That didn't go anywhere. I think at the end of the day, it's easier said than done. That
It
part.
didn't go anywhere because there were still people in the Department of Justice, even if they were Republicans or ideologues, who understood that they had to follow some rules. I mean, they brought a weak case in front of a grand jury. The grand jury didn't indict it. But if they, I guess I'm not seeing where the fact that there are no consequences, that illegal, unlawful actions can be clothed with the veneer of officiality, of constitutionality, because they come from the mouth of a president, I think really does change the landscape. And by the way, let's even move away from DOJ. Let's go back to 1970s Chile, okay? And we'll just keep picking on George Conway.
Oh my gosh, poor George.
Yeah, like a black van shows up in the middle of the night and disappears him. And let's say his friends like us, we go file a petition for habeas corpus, which requires the Justice Department to provide a justification, or not just the executive branch to provide a justification for, why they're holding them, and, really where they're holding him. They're the literal words are to have the body. They're supposed to like bring the body to court, and Trump just doesn't comply. He just tells his Justice Department, "Yeah, don't answer the petition." Where's the enforcement? How is the court going to enforce its order for the executive branch to tell them where they've taken this person?
I agree that in that circumstance, if Donald Trump is just like, I am not following the laws, like I set aside the Constitution of the United States,
Yeah.
then I agree. Then then that's the end of everything. I agree with that. But I think that would obviously be unlawful. And so it would essentially be a move by him and saying, instead of saying I will protect the Constitution, just saying I'm casting it aside. And I don't know whether we're there yet at that point. So I'm like,
No, he does it constitutionally. He suspends habeas, like Lincoln.
Yeah, well, then there would be a suit about that, right? That would all get litigated in the courts as well. Your point is, what if he doesn't enforce any court's order?
Correct.
Right. That's like a Jackson sort of President Jackson situation. Like, let it, or isn't he the one let him enforce it or something? Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. Obviously, that's always been a danger in the American experiment. Like, what if we have a president who just says, I'm not going to enforce the laws, and I'm not going to faithfully execute the laws. If we're there yet, then we don't have a constitution anymore. That's true.
What if Congress, under Republican control, authorizes some use of force against some vague and undefined war, and all of a sudden people are declared enemy combatants? Which, by the way, is exactly what happened under the War on Terror. And I mean, this is, under Supreme Court precedent, it is possible to round up enemy combatants and put them in camps. Frankly, even if they were U.S. citizens. Like, there are ways to do it, quote unquote, legally and constitutionally. People don't understand how vast executive power is, and how simply reframing something, or, you know,
I
just
understand what you're saying.
jimmying with it a little bit, you can accomplish a lot of things that people did not think were possible. And I mean, it's an extreme situation, but I kind of feel like we should entertain it as a possibility, because there are some
It's a
kook pots that are coming in.
There's no question in my mind that there are some crazy people coming that are potentially coming into power. Mike Davis is already talking about, with glee about separating children from their parents, right? I'm
He's
sure he'll
talking
say,
about dragging Letitia James through the streets.
I I saw those comments. So,
And this is
that's
somebody
why
who is as far as I understand, is being considered for attorney general.
I hear you. I mean, I'm not trying to. That's what I'm saying. I don't view myself as a Pollyannish person, um, at all. I think I'm very hard nosed realist, but I think I would take this step by step. I mean, to me, there's certain obvious things that are going to happen. Okay, will migrants be put into camps? Yes. Will Trump radically change American foreign policy? Yes. Will he sell out Ukraine? Yes. Will he undermine NATO? Yes. Will he try to fire mass amounts of government employees? Yes. Those things I think are without a doubt going to happen. What I'm trying to draw a line on is like there's a jump to go from there to he is going to throw, whatever, George Conway, Norm Eisen, Nancy Pelosi,
Renato
Eric Swalwell,
Mariotti and Asha
Renato,
Rangappa.
and Asha Rangappa into camps. I think that's we'll see. We'll see whether that happens or not. But I think there's a big people tend to paint in extremes. And I actually think the biggest danger for the American experiment here is a faint shades of gray slippage into authoritarianism, not it happening all at once. Like if it happens all at once, people will see that and they will react. Like one thing we have, yes, I appreciate that there's a lot of disinformation out there, but we now have a society which information is spread very easily and in which it's spread by all sorts of information sources. And I think if really, at whatever, they're going into your suburban neighborhood and just rounding up people and throwing them in camps, that would have a very intense reaction from the American populace. I think it's very different when the temperature increases slightly, just like the
Boiling
frog
frog.
boiling. Yeah. So that's what I think is a more likely approach where they're like, okay, now the president has direct control of the DOJ. And he's not going to do all that much stuff. He might do things around the edges, but just the mere fact that he does is going to silence some people or going to deter them on the edges from speaking. Maybe they'll do a case here or there, and all they need to do is one or two just to make a point. And maybe they won't even go all the way to the end, but just the mere fact of being prosecuted is a threat. And then, as to, they're going to deport the migrants and they'll have camps now. Maybe they won't use them, they'll just use them for migrants and so forth. But they're making the point, by setting those up that, hey, they could potentially round up others, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think you're underestimating the amount of desensitization that has already happened, the boiling frogness that's already happened, which I think is evident just in the election of Donald Trump again, after he literally tried to overthrow the government. Um, that's kind of boiling froggy. And I mean, here's the thing. Let's just imagine this. There's going to be a Muslim ban on day one. They're going to
Yeah, I
reissue
think
it.
that's right.
They're going to reissue it. And guess what? I don't think this time you're going to have thousands of people protesting at airports. I think it's just expected now. And we're going to be like, yeah, I guess he's doing the Muslim ban again. So, we've already seen the child separations and the detention camps to some degree. It's going to happen, and they're going to build more. And as Ruth Ben-Ghiat says, the purpose of expanding these kinds of detention facilities is to create the infrastructure for future use. That's what historical examples tell us. So you're right on that front, that it's not only a signal, but I think, there is a real danger. And then I'll add this, which is, it's not just Trump, right? Like, Trump may actually be really happy just playing golf and pilfering the US Treasury and honestly, like, riding out the end of his days or whatever. But there are some really, really crazy people. We mentioned Mike Davis, Stephen Miller, a lot of these other people who truly get joy from cruelty. I think Trump does too, but it's like it's so self-referential that it's really about, his own revenge, etc. But I think at the end of the day, like, he can also get distracted or be flattered into doing something else. I think there are other people who will have much more sway in this administration that really want to see that type of oppressive structure. I mean, the vice president, JD Vance, loves Orban, loves him, and wants to create another regime like that here. So I don't know. I know I'm being alarm. I don't know that I'm being alarmist. I think I'm being realistic, and I know that it's scary, and I just think we need to be prepared
Well,
for it being worse than we think it could be.
I am an incredibly cynical person, and that's just been shaped by my life experiences. I've been through a lot and I've seen a lot in my career, in my life. I'm always prepared for the worst case scenario. Um, what I'm trying to do is just say that, moving the machinery of power at this scale is complicated and difficult, and it's harder than making a speech. In throughout American history, we have lots of people make speeches about changing everything. And sometimes it's positive. Like Barack Obama can give a lot of speeches about hope and change. It's much easier to give speeches about hope and change than it is to turn the machinery of the United States government to radically change in one direction or another. And our system is set up in many ways to make it difficult to do that. You have to get all these different things lined up essentially to make substantial change. Yes, if you sweep aside the Constitution, you don't care about the laws, yes, things can be very easy. If you're going to at least pay lip service to those things in the short run, there are obstacles, there are costs. There's a lot of static and a lot of transaction costs there. And Donald Trump, in my opinion, is much better at giving bloviated speeches about doing things than he is about actually running things. There's a very significant distinction between those two. And I am I am just as realistic, pessimistic, however you want to look at it, cynical about what Donald Trump is going to accomplish, as I am about the people who are against him, saying that they were going to do whatever, throw him in chains. That's the way I look at it.
So you're saying that maybe the best we can hope for is that he's too incompetent.
I think what we're going to have is there's going to be damage done in the next few years for sure. We're looking at destructive United States foreign policy. We're looking at millions of people hurt in very serious ways. I mean, I'm not suggesting that there's not going to be just tremendous suffering by large groups of people, I just named a few off the top of my head, right? Like migrants and government employees and transgender Americans. I mean, there's a lot of people who are going to be very, very seriously in the crosshairs. I don't think I'm suggesting like some fairy tale future. I'm just suggesting that he's going to have every one of these things. There's going to be a fight, and he's not going to be able to fight every battle at once. And the goal here, the hope here, is got to be to limit the damage so that we can emerge from this and have an actual reckoning that gets our country back on the track that is, the track that we had all hoped for, a track of democracy.
And what does that look like, Renato? We have an election in 4 years, if we're lucky. JD Vance will be running for president. He loses, and then he will preside to certify his own loss.
I understand that, although the new electoral count act, remember last week where you and I were just sitting there watching an optimistic Norm show. I'm not as optimistic as Norm, but I think in that circumstance, I do think it would be very difficult for JD Vance to try to set aside the votes. I mean, he's not a very popular guy. He's no Donald Trump. Um, it would be very difficult for him to set aside the results of an election. I do think I am a hopeful. I wouldn't say think. I'm hopeful that we'll have another election, Asha, but I'm not willing to concede that yet. And I
Okay,
I take a
fair enough.
wait and
I don't
see.
want to concede that yet either.
Yeah, I have a wait and see attitude towards all of this. And that's just the way I am in general. My approach, I help people solve a lot of really difficult problems all the time. And I'm usually trying to be careful, trying to keep our options open, trying to assess things, prepare for the worst, but realize that often things can get or aren't as bad as you think if you can kind of delay and obstruct. It's a lot easier to delay and obstruct than it is to accomplish things. And I think Donald
Well, we
Trump's
learned
gonna
that from Trump's first presidency,
right.
or at least
Right.
from his handling of cases. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think if there's a hopefulness that people want to get out of this, it's that. Now you're on the obstructionist side. That's a lot easier to accomplish than at least in American constitutional structure than it is to be the side trying to have transformative change. It's only happened a few times in U.S. history.
Well, Renato, I hope that we end up close to each other if we are in the camps.
Same here. I hope we end up in the same camp. I'll pass you notes.
See.
So, Asha, we have spent, it seems like years now, at least many, many months, talking about the various legal issues surrounding Donald Trump. And I think it's fair to say that focus of our podcast will come to an end. We're going to have many new legal issues to talk about, but that is not going to be one of them going forward.
Yeah, I mean, all of those are dead in the water at this point. I guess we should just go through them, maybe. We'll start. Let's start with. I mean, Georgia is not going to get revived. I don't
Yeah,
even know
I
what's
think
going to happen with that. I don't even know where is it in some appellate court right now. Guys,
going
that's
nowhere.
it's not gonna happen. It's not happening anymore. Plus, it's unclear what the immunity rule. I mean, that could be caught in litigation forever, even if it were to go forward, and it's not going to go forward as long as he's president. So
Yeah. Could you imagine that? Like the state of Georgia, could you imagine if that actually went forward? The state of Georgia is like, we want to imprison the president of the United States. Like, I mean, that's just silly on its face. I'm just being candid with you.
I
I don't
mean,
see that going
technically
anywhere.
speaking, Georgia is a separate sovereign. I mean, one imagines if, a serial killer was discovered and happened to be running for president and won. I mean, if you put this in some other context, I think there can be an argument that you would still want the state to be able to vindicate it. But of course, that presumes that there is some consensus that the actions that were taken were so horrendous, and that this person, that it would be a good thing for this person to be taken out of the Oval Office. And I think that's the problem that you have with the crimes that Trump has been charged with in that case, and the January 6th case, is that we don't have the moral consensus on what on that those crimes are bad, or that they were even crimes at all.
I think that's fair. It's an interesting point. I mean, I did hear, for example, a lot of folks on the right saying the other day that the country has decided that the public has weighed in and they've decided that these things aren't crimes or whatever. They've vindicated. I wish my clients got to have a nationwide vote on whether they should spend 10 years in prison or 2 years in prison or whatever. I mean, the reality of this of the matter is that there can be unjust results that occur from crimes that are on the books all the time. It's an interesting feature here that instead of being treated no better than anyone else. He gets a special pass to do what he wants to do. It's incredibly contrary to the way our system works overall.
Well, he's Teflon Don, so it's he's gotten a lot of good breaks. Speaking of, I think he's going to get a break in New York. I mean, we've already talked a lot about his sentencing and that it's unlikely that he, even before the election, that he was going to get jail time. But
Right.
at this point, I mean, do you see Mershon even sentencing him at all? Because there is now this other legal issue about whether the evidence that was used in that trial should not have been admitted because it now could fall under, this official acts paradigm. Whether or not it impacts the outcome, it's an open question that I assume would need to get litigated, and you wouldn't sentence someone before resolving that.
I think that is right. As a practical matter, I think Mershon is going to punt this one way or the other. There is a substantial legal issue here, and I really, you mentioned Trump got lucky. I think Trump got saved by the United States Supreme Court and
Yeah.
the votes that he had there. That's ultimately what saved him there. That's what delayed this sentencing in New York. And Judge Egoran, by the way, I mean, Egoran is another potential target. I mean, who knows? I mean, he's very high on the list of people that I could see, Trump or John Juan Mershon, excuse me, in this case, but certainly Judge Egoran as well. They both are people that
Yeah.
Trump could have in his target. So yeah, I don't see Judge Mershon doing that. And then Asha, as to the federal cases, Jack Smith has essentially conceded, that they're not really going to go forward. He's vacated the deadlines, essentially awaiting instructions from Main Justice on what to do. And I actually will say, I'm curious what you think. I've seen some people critical of that, discussing that. I actually think, given the circumstances, I think it would be a mistake for him to try to press onward. I actually think I don't even think it makes any sense. There's nothing that would get completed before January 6th. So I don't really see the point of it.
I agree, and I think he's being smart. And here's why. If he were to press on, he would simply press on, and then as soon as a new AG was appointed, he'd be fired. That's
Right.
what would happen. I mean, let's just face it. So, and at that point, he'd be fired. He'd be whatever, mid-case or doing whatever, and that would be the end of it. By wrapping up now, he's actually required under the special counsel regulations to send a report to the Attorney General on the investigation, on what the investigation uncovered, what the decisions that he made to prosecute, why he made those decisions, who he considered prosecuting that he declined to prosecute, why that happened. I mean, this was all in the Mueller report. He has to submit that to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General may, in his discretion, if he believes that it's in the public interest, release it to the public. Now, we can have a separate question about what we think Garland will do, but I think that is what Jack Smith is thinking ahead to, which is those will be very lengthy reports, and they'll be very detailed reports. And I mean, he's handling two major cases. And I think if he wants to have those reports done and in Merrick Garland's hot, sweaty little hands before January 20th, then his teams needs to start working on it. And let's just be clear, if Garland doesn't release those reports publicly, they will never see the light of day. Once a new DOJ takes control, but we haven't even talked about this. Like he could order it all destroyed. So in many ways, this is really, without a trial, could be I think there's three big things. One is perhaps the only way for the public to ever know of what was truly uncovered in this investigation. I think less important in January 6th, because the January 6th committee did a lot of that public education of what January 6th was about. But in the Mar-a-Lago case, there may be a lot that can't be declassified, but things like, did he uncover why Trump did this? There must have been a motive that he uncovered. And I think that is really critical for the public to know, because this is a person who's going to be in charge of our state secrets again. I think the second reason is to actually have a historical record that is out there that can't be destroyed or buried as it can if it's just left in DOJ. And I had a third reason, but I forgot what that was.
No, look, I think this could be important. I don't remember, Asha. This is a great point that you've made, by the way, about the report. I think that makes a lot of sense. But wasn't there some provision in the regulations for Congress or for certain members of Congress to get that report?
Congress can get the report, or not. Congress doesn't automatically get the report. I don't think you can pull it up. It's when the special counsel wants to take a prosecutorial step and he is overruled by the attorney general. Then the attorney general must report to the chair and ranking member of the House and Senate Judiciary Committees that he overruled the special counsel. This was put in as a way to create a channel for sunlight. If you had an AG who was sort of, intent on quashing a special counsel investigation on behalf of a president, so to prevent that from happening. But I believe that the decision to actually release the report is up to the attorney general. I don't think that report automatically goes. Of course, the committees could request it.
I think that's likely what happened. So I really do think it makes some sense for him to write a report. I think whether that gets to the public, I don't know, but you'd have to think that it would if he did. We'll see whether that occurs.
You think Merrick Garland would release it?
No, Merrick Garland.
Sorry, I'm so angry right now with Merrick Garland. I can't even.
I know.
Don't get me started.
I think I agree with you on that. I think Merrick Garland didn't.
He screwed the pooch.
He was too. Well, he just moved too little, too late.
The pooch. Yes.
Too little, too late in terms of what he did here. Very slow, very deliberate. I think that, but I will take a broader view.
Wait. Not slow and deliberate. He was not taking any action until basically Cassidy Hutchinson dropped her bombshells in July of 2022. By all accounts, he was not pursuing an investigation. And I was so shocked when I found that out, because I was convinced that the Department of Justice would be duty bound to investigate after January 6th. And I just think that was a dereliction of duty if that's not what was happening.
Yeah, if that's true, I agree. I felt like it wasn't 100% established, but I agree. There's no question that whatever he did, it was like, I wasn't sure if there was a lot of whatever hand wringing in the beginning, but the bottom line is, one way or the other, they didn't get it done. They had years to do it. Ultimately, they didn't even really move forward quickly on anything until very late in the game. Too late, obviously, as it turned out. But I think I have well,
one more thing, because we also, just while we're talking about Merrick Garland, I think that he also could have decided to actually prosecute some of the counts of obstruction of justice from the Mueller report. And you know what? That would have gotten litigated. It would have gone to the Supreme Court, and it would have, at that stage, it is really unclear to me, like, especially in the aftermath of January 6th, when it was like uncertain that Trump would be the nominee again. It's entirely possible that the conception of immunity would have been very different.
Yeah.
Possibly more limited.
Yeah, I was going to take an even broader view than that. Okay. And this is, I really think that it goes beyond Garland just to the whole administration. But I think if I have an indictment on the Biden administration, or generally, it would be that they did not take seriously the threat of Trumpism and these forces and what had happened in the 4 years prior, and have a reckoning such that they said, how can we reform our system to ensure that this doesn't happen again? And how can we look back at all of the abuses of the last 4 years and make sure that it's all brought to light and people are held and taken into account? There was no investigation of all sorts of abuses of things that happened, interference into DOJ investigations, abuse of prosecutorial power. None of that was investigated. None of it was brought to light. I had advocated before Biden was sworn in that there should be a special counsel appointed on day one, not
Yep.
just look at the Mueller report stuff, but all sorts of questionable, unconstitutional, unlawful actions. And then this way the public knows, and it's almost like a truth and reconciliation thing,
Yeah.
where it's like, look, let's look at all this that happened and all decide as a society, we don't want to go down that road again. And here's how we're going to reform the system to make sure this never happens. That never occurred. There was this assumption that if we just sort of have like a pretend that it didn't happen and go la 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 and put our hands over our ears, then this way it sort of wallpapers over the problem, and it didn't happen. That's my biggest concern.
Yeah, it was like, we're going to return to norms and
Right.
everything will be fine. That was just an aberration. And there was a lot of hubris, I think, that I just think there was an assumption that Trump would not run again. Or
Yeah.
like that the Republicans would never select. I mean, in that initial kind of 18-month period, I think there was sort of a complacency that you could just get back to normal. And, by the time the realization starts to set in that, no, we're not returning back to normal. We're just actually going back to the crazy. As you said, there was nothing that was done. I mean, basically, the Electoral Count Reform Act is, as far as I know of, really the only thing that directly addressed what took place during the Trump years.
Right. I agree with that. And I mean, what bothers me the most, Asha, is just there's not even like any sort of investigation that says, here's the facts of what happened. At least with January 6th, you had the work of Congress,
Yeah.
that select committee. But for a lot of other things, I have to go to like Jeff Berman's book to find out what happened. In the Southern District of New York, like that's a problem for me. That the United States Department of Justice, for example, is not investigating why all these line prosecutors were quitting off of investigations. There's an interference in the Flynn sentencing. Like, why aren't we finding out what was happening actually with these children being separated from their parents? Like, how did that come about? Who's responsible for that? How do we make sure that doesn't happen
Because
again?
Merrick Garland didn't want to break a norm, which is to treat your predecessor with, to have comedy and a certain amount of deference for the things that they did. That, if he went and started investigating Barr's DOJ and how it was operating, that's opening the doors. And I think this is one of the most fundamental problems with here's the thing. The Trump administration is going to do what it's going to do no matter what. They might use a breaking of norms as a convenient excuse for doing the same, but following norms and using established guardrails and, showing courtesy and all this kind of stuff they're not going to be like, oh, I guess we need to do that too. They're not. And I think that was the fundamental miscalculation in a lot of different areas, but definitely with Merrick Garland and the way that he approached DOJ.
I do think that part of it is a broader thing with the administration. That's why I'm not even just singling them out. Because I actually think, Asha, that there was a sense from the administration that, from a political perspective, it was better to be focused on the future than the past. And they needed to be demonstrating and doing things on kitchen table issues and focused on infrastructure, focused on this and focused on that. And of course, that you do. I mean, there's no question that people care about actually helping their lives. But I think there was almost like a sense of like looking backwards is not helpful to us. And it was a very much a short-term focus on political calculus versus what was right in the long run for the country. That's my opinion at least.
It was a bad calculus.
So Asha, I hear you have a very big birthday coming up.
I do. I turn 50 on November 15th.
I It's hard for me to believe you look young. I'm 48. You look younger than me. A
Aw,
lot younger than
thank
me. You're so well.
you.
You're gorgeous. Yeah, you are beautiful,
Thank
and
you.
yeah, you look great. So I have to say though, for me too, as I've gotten older, you do start like realizing, does your body have changes as you get older? Like, that's how it's felt like for me.
Yeah. Yeah, just I mean, we talked about this in previous episodes, just that, harder to stay in shape. And,
Yes.
you have to restrict your food intake and exercise more just to get the same kind of results, and um more prone to injury. Now,
Yes.
I feel like I'm much more sensitive to sleep. Like, in other words, sleep can really, really impact my days and how much I
Yeah.
can get done. Um, Alcohol impacts my sleep more than it used to. I mean, just all kinds of stuff. It's a drag. When did we hit our peak? Like, when did
So
the decline start? I feel like I
I
started really feeling it like 5 years ago,
that's
but I'm just
interesting.
curious. Like, did we hit our? Was I 30 and pregnant, and that was like the best days of my life, and I didn't know it? I hated being pregnant, by the way.
I think we have different peaks for different things. Like, I mean, as a lawyer and in my career, I'm still in the early part of the peak of my career. I mean, a lawyer's 50s are usually their most productive time of their lives because of their careers, because you learn a lot, you get all this wisdom and experience, and you finally reach a point where that it combines with all the other skills you have and you're really effective. Like I'm much more effective in everything that I do now than I used to be 10 years ago. I didn't realize it back then, but I am now. I think though, physically, my peak was maybe when I was, oh, I don't know. For me, it was like when I was 39 because I lost a lot of weight.
Mm.
But yeah, I do. There is a part of me that feels that like, well, I'll never have. I wish that I had that level of strength or that level of fitness that I had back then. That does bother me a little bit.
Yeah, I wish I had the metabolism I did back then.
Yeah, that's a big one
That's
for
such a
sure.
drag, man.
Do
Sucks.
you feel I'm curious though, one thing, I feel younger than I am probably. Do you
Mhm.
feel that way? Do you feel like did you feel so you seem so vibrant and so full of energy.
Yes, I completely. And my friends and I talk about this. Like, we're like, when I think back to, for example, when I was my kids' age, they're 15 and 18. Someone who was 50 was like really freaking old. And they look
Yeah,
really freaking old. And then I'm like, I don't like, is that how they see me? Because I don't feel that way, but I guess they do.
they do to an extent, yeah. My
I don't know.
associate, has told me recently how old I am. Like, I do certain things that I'm like, very old. Like, she's like, "You use voice to text, that's so old. That's something old people do." I'm like, "Really?" I don't think of myself as old, I just think of myself as efficient. That's, like, faster than typing it. Um,
Yeah.
wow.
Well, I'm hitting 50. I'm feeling good.
You
Um, I can't complain. So,
Absolutely. You're doing great. A happy birthday, Asha.
thank you.